Hello, hello. How are you? Sorry about the weird blink on the overlay, but that's just this computer really not coping well with the warmth at the moment. I really need to get it sorted out and get onto the other computer. I think I'm looking a little bit brighter, but probably still all sparkly around the edges. Such is life. One day I'll get myself sorted out with a little bit better lighting and actually use a normal backdrop instead of the image behind me at the moment, which apparently is somewhere in Prince Edward Island, one of the rural communities over there, somewhere. So anyway, here we go. Where are we up to? We've had one reading, which was, I think, 2 chapters from our new book, which is Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery. That's Lucy Maud Montgomery, very famously known for having written the Anne of Green Gables series of books, the Anne books, they're sometimes referred to as. And what was a sleepy little backwater, Prince Edward Island, has in part become overwhelmed by visitors who want to go and see the places that she made famous by writing about them, including the house that inspired the Green Gables house, the place where she was born, which, because there was some dispute about inheritance, got left to rack and ruin, is basically now just the foundation stones and somebody takes care of the grounds. So that, not Anne, but Ms. Montgomery. What else can I tell you about that? It's over on the east coast of Canada, and I have a map for you. I just have to get it out for you. Sorry. I was going to get it all ready beforehand, but I had to edit it, and because my computer is being a little bit, you might say, difficult at the moment, because I really do need to replace it with the other one, it means that some things take a lot longer than they ought to. Like at the moment, it's decided that its processing is going to run at 100%. So if this stutters, I will try not to keep talking and try not to keep reading. I shall just pause and let the computer catch up. So don't panic if I stop, okay? It's because I'm trying to allow the computer to calm its brain down a little. And then I will carry on reading. Now, I do have somewhere here the map. Right, which one do I start with? Here we go. I shall put the map here, and I shall probably, no, I won't turn myself off. I'll just move a little. Turn on the map. There you go. And I shall move. Here you go. So this is the east coast of Canada. That is Newfoundland, which is a great big island and a whole bunch of other islands. This is Nova Scotia down, I'm going this way, but it's not that way, it's that way. I would make a terrible newsreader, wouldn't I? So this is Nova Scotia, and this lump up here that comes like this is New Brunswick, which is where my aunt lives now, and I remember visiting her when she was living over here in Halifax, and then later on in New Glasgow. Now, there's also a New Glasgow on Prince Edward Island, which is this island here, which is vaguely banana-shaped. I probably should have just said crescent last time instead of banana-shaped. Sorry about that, people. But yes, they have a New Glasgow, and they have a New Glasgow. And I don't know, it probably causes all sorts of problems with mail delivery. But there's another map. Wait, there's more. I'll just get you the next one. Why are you looking in the same place as the old book, which I've already told you to look somewhere else? Yes, I'm talking to my computer. I do that frequently. I also have a picture of the author for you. I don't need to show you the picture of where Prince Edward Island is circled, because I've basically already sorted all that out. So this is Prince Edward Island itself. I'm going to make it ever so slightly smaller so you can see it as fits the inside the framework here. That's better. So Oops, I'm disappearing out of shot, but that's okay. And catching hold of boxes with the wheels on my chair. So this here is the mainland. This is New Brunswick. There's actually this big bridge here that runs... No, not that way, but that way. Not that way, but that way. That one there. That bridge there, sorry. This is hilarious. Anyway, so they have this bridge here, right here. This is where the bridge is, right where I'm clapping, right here. I'm grabbing hold of it. I think that's called Federation Bridge, and technically it's a relatively new thing. You used to have to catch a boat to get across, probably some sort of big ferry. And I would say from the size of the island and the fact that they have so many roads, it would at later stages they would have had car ferries for it. So most of Ms. Montgomery's writing is set around what is referred to as the North Coast, which is this piece of land here, this piece of land through here. I'm going to stop waving my hands around. The capital of the island, I think, is about here, and I think that's Charlottetown. I'm not sure. The university that she went to is there, and it has now been incorporated into I think that's where it is. I'm sorry. If I get this wrong, I do apologise, but you can type it into the chat and correct me if you wish, as long as you've actually looked it up or you do personally know this information. Don't just guess at it. But that is now actually where the whole island's university is based, and it's much bigger than it was when Maud, that's apparently what she used to get called, even though her name was Lucy, that's where she lived. Went to university, sorry. Eventually she did actually leave the island, but what happened then? She didn't end up moving back at any stage as far as I can tell, but it was definitely part of her. She was living on the island when she wrote the Anne books, or started writing them, and I'm not sure, but I think she was still on the island when she started with the Emily books. So this is the first of the series, but I'm only reading the one. You're most welcome to read the other books in the series. There are only 3 of them in the Emily series. That's Emily of New Moon, which is this book here, which if you're looking at the overlay here is up here above my right shoulder. And then there's Emily Climbs and Emily's Quest. I think that's the way they go. But because my focus is on reading children's books, and this is an older children's book, for me, there is not quite so much appeal to read Emily's Climb and Emily Climbs and Emily's Quest, because they are about her as a young adult in her late teens and early 20s, going off to university, getting married, all that sort of thing, which doesn't really appeal quite so much when you're looking for a little bit of escapism. So there you go. I don't mind if you want to read it. That's all good. That's wonderful. It's just that it's a little bit heavy for the sort of thing that we're reading here. This is not one of the books with lots and lots of shenanigans. This is definitely a more kind of drama, serious. It's got some elements of personal, mental, imaginary fantasy, but only for one of the characters, rather than actually being a fantasy book like some of our books have been, or children who get into all sorts of mischief, whether they intend to or not. Just, that's the way it works. Anyway, so we're going to carry on reading today, and we shall begin. Actually, I should introduce myself in case you're new here. Hi, if you're new, welcome. I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's books. This is probably a book targeted at the oldest of the age ranges that I tend to read for. I try to choose books that are entertaining rather than particularly boring. I don't see any point in reading just for the sake of reading if it's going to get too boring. There's a really wide range of books that I read. They're all almost all very old public domain books. There have been 1 or 2 that have been not in public domain, but almost in public domain. hopefully not causing any problems for anybody. They can always get hold of me if they want me to take them offline. That's okay. I'm happy to do that. But it needs to be a proper thing, not just somebody saying, oh, I think you ought to do this, because it's their opinion. Yeah. Anyway, so we're reading this for the fun of it. We're not reading it to make money. We're not reading it to become famous or anything. I think it's wonderful to actually explore old ways of looking at things, old ways of living and doing things, old ways of expressing things. And we can do that very easily through reading old-fashioned children's books, of which it is getting harder and harder to find them. Real physical books like this one, sorry, I'm just going to find it underneath my bit of green screen, such as this one. This is another old book, and we haven't actually read this one, I don't think. It's called The Moonstone Ring. It's actually called Losing and Finding, or The Moonstone Ring, and it was given as a Sunday school gift in 1897. So that's a little bit older. I would say that one's fairly definitely in the public domain. And it has illustrations like this in it. Quite different to modern illustrations. It's based on what they call an etching. So I grew up reading my parents' and my grandparents' old books, ones that they had grown up reading. That's how old they were. And because I live in a reasonably rural area, and we lived with our extended family around us, it became very, very easy to actually understand some old ways of doing things and the old ways of thinking. Not that my parents or grandparents were particularly old-fashioned, it's just that they made reference to a lot of old things. And I realised that even when I was at school, there was a lot of things that I understood that my schoolmates didn't understand, just because they had no connection with that sort of stuff. It's just been something that I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from. And so therefore it lends a little bit to the background chatter that I give you when I'm reading, because often there'll be pieces that the author has obviously assumed that everyone who's reading their book will understand, because at the time it was written they would have, obviously, but in this day and age are not understood. Or sometimes I'll give you some illustrations of experiences I've had, whether it's living in some of the places described, visiting them, or things that I've come across in the past anyway. So there you go. I've lived in several different places outside of where I currently live, but I have lived here most of my life. I've had 4 years in England. When I was a little child, I lived in part of Canada for not a year, but for a while. We had some family over there, so we spent some time with them. I've been all over the place. I've done all sorts of weird and wonderful things, even though it doesn't look like I'm that sort of a person. You never know what's under the skin, do you? Anyway, so let's get on with reading. I do have a couple of tips for you. I'm going to suggest get yourself something to drink. Have it handy and have a mouthful or two, or a good slurp or gulp or whatever. Just don't drown yourself whenever you're feeling like your mouth's getting a bit dry. I have to do that from time to time because my mouth gets dry, or else I start coughing sometimes. That's the other thing. So drink of water is great. Also having something nice to drink that you like aside from water is good. Like I've got the last of my coffee for today in here. If you have something to snack on, that's great. I've just been snacking on a banana. And I've also got some of my favourite crunchy crackers, which are very, very noisy, and I have to turn the microphone off for, or apologise for all the noise. So something to drink, something to snack on, and somewhere comfortable to sit or lie down if you want to. And I'm all for people lurking. That's the way storytelling and story reading generally goes. So if you're if you're listening and you want to chat, that's great. Type things into the chat box. I may or may not respond while I'm reading. It depends on what it is that you're saying. But usually I will try to focus on the actual story. Between chapters, I'll read the chat, comment on it, whatever, if it's relevant. If you want to tell me that you're here, but you're going to be lurking, you're most welcome to type !lurk in the text box, in the chat box, and I'm pretty sure that one of the chat bots will actually acknowledge that for you. And it just means that I can say hi and know that you're there and enjoying listening, hopefully. And we can carry on. It's not that you don't have to do that. Unlike most other places where lurkers specifically don't want to be called out, I'm aware of the fact that because the tendency when you're listening to read aloud stories is effectively to lurk, people are quite often happy to be acknowledged as being here listening, even if they're not engaging in chat. So, but yeah, pop in and say hi. That's lovely. And if you're watching this on YouTube and wondering what all this yakking is about, then check it out. Come on over to Twitch when I'm actually reading live and get involved with chatting. You can chat. I don't mind if you people chat amongst yourselves while I'm reading. That's also fine. That's quite all right. I mean, I do that a lot with friends who are gamers. We get some quite good chats going in the background while they're gaming, because I've got some good friends who are also in the chats as well as other ones who are playing games. So if you're on YouTube, you're missing out on the live experience. Come on over and join in. I read the same 3 days that I release my videos on, but I start half an hour earlier. So that's 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I start at 3 p.m. New Zealand time. And if you're on Twitch and you look at my schedule, it will show you in your time zone when that is. And if you follow me on Twitch, then it will also notify you. And if you want to if you're on Twitch and you're wanting to catch up on bits that you've missed out, then go over to my YouTube channel, also linked in my profile, which will be below somewhere here. And then you can listen to some of the other stories we've had. We've had Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. We've had The Wind in the Willows. We've had the Millie Molly Mandy stories, Secret Garden, A Little Princess, the George MacDonald books, 2 of the George MacDonald books. That was The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and Curdie, rather odd fantasy stories. There's a bunch of other ones we've had too, and I can't remember the names of them all. There's quite a few. So yeah, if you're wanting something to listen to when you're doing housework or doing study or homework or other work, and you need something to occupy your ears and your brain when your hands and your eyes are doing something, listening to books is great. And I will say that these are much more like bedtime stories than audiobooks. I don't read perfectly. I get lost in the middle of a page, in the middle of a sentence, while I'm reading it sometimes. It's hilarious. It's probably also one of my ADHD tendencies. And if there's an accent, it tends to be pretty, we don't go for accuracy on accents. The main reason if I use any accent in the story that I'm reading will just be to differentiate between the main character or whoever else is speaking and somebody else who has quite a bit of dialogue in that chapter or something, but is not one that we want to mix up with what the main character is saying. And so, especially if it's someone who's doing a job like it's a maid or a housekeeper or the farmer or something, it's much easier to differentiate just by giving it a little bit of an accent. But they are in no way accurate. So apologies already. This book is set in Canada. I do not speak with a Canadian accent. I have a good friend who does, although it's a little bit modified now because she's spent most of her life in New Zealand. And the same with her daughter, actually. So I don't sound like a Canadian, as you can tell. This is a Kiwi accent, a New Zealand accent, and this is normal for me. It does at times, especially if I'm reading an English book, it does sound a little bit more English, partly because I've spent 4 years living there and got used to hearing a certain type of English accent, and partly also because I come from a family that had quite a few teachers in, and they appreciated well-spoken English and used to correct quite a bit. So I have actually, before I'd even gone to England, when I was a kid, I had people saying, "Oh, you must have been young when you came from England. You've still got a lovely English accent, but I can tell that you've been living in New Zealand for a while." And I'm like, no, I'm a Kiwi. I was, this is home. This is my accent. It's ridiculous. Anyway, enough of that. It's 3:20 and it's time to read because we haven't yet. So This is Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery, and we are reading Chapter 3, starting with Chapter 3 today, A Hop Out of Kin. Douglas Starr lived 2 weeks more. In after years, when the pain had gone out of their recollection, Emily thought they were the most precious of her memories. They were beautiful weeks, beautiful and not sad, and one night when he was lying on the couch in the sitting room, with Emily beside him in the old wing chair, he went past the curtain, went so quietly and easily that Emily did not know he had gone, until she suddenly felt the strange stillness of the room. There was no breathing in it but her own. "Father, father," she cried, and then she screamed for Ellen. Ellen Green told the Murrays, when they came, that Emily had behaved real well when you took everything into account. To be sure, she had cried all night and hadn't slept a wink. None of the Maywood people who came flocking kindly in to help could comfort her. But when morning came, her tears were all shed. She was pale and quiet and docile. "That's right now," said Ellen. "That's what comes of being properly prepared. Your pa was so mad at me for warning you that he wasn't rightly civil to me since, and him a dying man. But I don't hold any grudge against him. I did my duty. Mrs. Hubbard's fixing up a black dress for you, and it'll be ready for supper time. Your ma's people will be here tonight, so they've telegraphed. So they've telegraphed, and I'm bound they'll find you looking respectable. They're well off, and they'll provide for you. Your pa hasn't left a cent. But there ain't any debts, I'll say that for him. Have you been in to see the body?" "Don't call him that," cried Emily, wincing. It was horrible to hear father called that, the body. Sorry, I'm just checking my phone in case there's something I'm meant to have done with it. Because that does. Oopsie, it's talking to me. No, we don't want that. Go away. Shh. Anyway, I don't know why it was talking to me, but it was. No, this is not ASMR. But if you like listening to words, it can be, if you like. Anyway, nice to know that my microphone and my subtitling or closed captioning picks up on the whispers. Right, carrying on. Don't call him that," cried Emily, wincing. It was horrible to hear father call that a body. "Why not? If you ain't the queerest child. He makes a better looking corpse than I thought he would, what with being so wasted and all. He was always a pretty man, though too thin." "Ellen Green," said Emily suddenly, "if you say any more of those things about father, I will put the black curse on you." Ellen Green stared. "I don't know what on earth you mean, but that's no way to talk to me after all I've done for you. You'd better not let the Murrays hear you talking like that, or they won't want much to do with you. The black curse, indeed. Well, here's gratitude." Emily's eyes smarted. She was just a lonely, solitary little creature, and she felt very friendless. But she was not at all remorseful for what she had said to Ellen, and she was not going to pretend she was. "Come you here and help me wash these dishes," ordered Ellen. "It'll do you good to have something to take up your mind, and then you won't be after putting curses on people who have worked their fingers to the bone for you." Emily, with an eloquent glance at Ellen's hands, went and got the dish towel. "Your hands are fat and pudgy," she said. "The bones don't show at all." "Never mind sassing back. It's awful, with your poor pa dead in there. But if your Aunt Ruth takes you, she'll soon cure you of that." "Is Aunt Ruth going to take me?" "I don't know, but she ought to. She's a widow with no chick or child, and well-to-do." "I don't think I want Aunt Ruth to take me," said Emily deliberately, after a moment's reflection. "Well, you won't have the choosing likely. You ought to be thankful to get a home anywhere. Remember, you're not of much importance." "I'm important to myself," cried Emily proudly. "It'll be some chore to bring you up," muttered Ellen. Your Aunt Ruth is the one to do it, in my opinion. She won't stand no nonsense. A fine woman she is, and the neatest housekeeper on P.E. Island. You could eat off her floor. P.E. Island is Prince Edward Island. It's a common term for it, either PEI or P.E. Island. There you go. I don't want to eat off her floor. I don't care if a floor is dirty as long as the tablecloth is clean. That's a good point. Well, her tablecloths are clean too, I reckon. She's got an elegant house in Shrewsbury with bow windows and wooden lace all round the roof. It's very stylish. It would be a fine home for you. She'd learn you some sense and do you a world of good. I'm just going to have a quick look and see where Shrewsbury is. I'm pretty sure it's a real place. No, not that one. Sorry, go away. Just having my browser picking up on the wrong piece of information. Maps. Yes, this is one of the reasons why we get lost sometimes when I'm reading. It's because I get distracted by this wonderful information that might be there. And now it's Shrewsbury. And I'm going to say it's Shrewsbury the way we call the Shrewsbury biscuits in New Zealand. In England, there's a place called Shrewsbury, and most of the other places called Shrewsbury are named after it. And there's a lot of division over whether it's Shrewsbury or Shrewsbury. It's a little bit like scones and scones. I'm not really posh when it comes to certain things. Doesn't look like the maps can tell me where Shrewsbury is. It may be made up for the story, or it actually may be somewhere that used to be called Shrewsbury and no longer is. Don't know. Someone can find that out and put it in the chat for us, or on our Discord server. And there's a link for that in my profile down below. There you go. We'll carry on. She's got an elegant house in Shrewsbury with box windows and wooden lace all round the roof. It's very stylish. It would be a fine home for you. She'd learn you some sense and do you a world of good. I don't want to learn sense and be done a world of good too, cried Emily with a quivering lip. I want somebody to love me. Well, you've got to behave yourself if you want people to like you. You're not to blame so much. Your pa has spoiled you. I told him so often enough, but he just laughed. I hope he ain't sorry for it now. The fact is, Emily Starr, you're queer and folks don't care for queer children. How am I queer? Demanded Emily. You talk queer and you act queer, and at times you look queer, and you're too old for your age, though that ain't your fault. It comes of never mixing with other children. I always threeped at your father to send you to school. Learning at home ain't the same thing, but he wouldn't listen to me, of course. I don't say but what you are as far along in book learning as you need to be, but what you want is to learn how to be like other children. In one way, it would be a good thing if your Uncle Oliver would take you. Don't know who Uncle Oliver is. Sorry, I'm just going to move my camera a little so I can change the way I'm sitting without it being too awkward, like too much of my head being cut off. Anyway. So obviously there's been a bit of discussion amongst the Murray family as to who she's going to live with. Where do we get up to? Old use of the word queer. The earlier meaning of it meaning odd, unusual, which is probably where the other alternative use has originally sprung from, just because people didn't understand. So we'll carry on. In one way, it would be a good thing if your Uncle Oliver would take you, for he's got a big family, but he's not as well off as the rest, so it ain't likely he will. Your Uncle Wallace might, seeing as he reckons himself the head of the family. He's only got a grown-up daughter, but his wife's delicate, or fancies she is. I wish Aunt Laura would take me, said Emily. She remembered that Father had said Aunt Laura was something like her mother. Aunt Laura, she won't have no say in it. Elizabeth's boss at New Moon. Jimmy Murray runs the farm, but he ain't quite all there, I'm told. What part of him isn't there? Asked Emily, curiously. Laws, it's something about his mind, child. He's a bit simple. Some accident or other when he was a youngster, I've heard. It addled his head, kind of. Elizabeth was mixed up in it some way. I've never heard the rights of it. I don't reckon the New Moon people will want to be bothered with you. They're awful set in their ways. You take my advice and try to please your Aunt Ruth. Be polite and well behaved. Maybe she'll take a fancy to you. There, that's all the dishes. You better go upstairs and be out of the way. Can I take Mike and Saucy Sal? Asked Emily. No, you can't. They'd be company for me, pleaded Emily. Company or no company, you can't have them. They're outside and they'll stay outside. I ain't going to have them tracking all over the house. The floor's been scrubbed. Why didn't you scrub the floor when Father was alive? Asked Emily. He liked things to be clean. You hardly ever scrubbed it then. Why do you do it now? Listen to her. Was I to be always scrubbing floors with my rheumatiz? Get off upstairs and you better lie down a while. I'm going upstairs, but I'm not going to lie down, said Emily. I've got a lot of thinking to do. There's one thing I'd advise you to do, said Ellen, determined to lose no chance of doing her duty. And that's to kneel down and pray to God to make you a good and respectful and grateful child. Emily paused at the foot of the stairs and looked back. Father said I wasn't to have anything to do with your God, she said gravely. Sorry, and I've just realised that for some reason I'm accidentally making my camera bounce. It's probably because I'm holding my book, and while I'm holding my book, I'm just going to see if I can move it to a more stable position where it's propped up. Yes, we all want to know what happened next, but I do need to get this so it's not wobbling around. And much as you might think that you do something the same way every time, you actually discover that you do it slightly differently every time. Have you discovered that yet? Life is like that. It's full of weird little things like that. Something needs to go under there to stop it tipping over. We don't want it tipping over, really. No, that's not going to work. Not working. I'm just trying to see if I can get it to stop sliding around. That might work better. Right, okay. Father said I wasn't to have anything to do with your God, she said gravely. Ellen gasped foolishly, but could not think of any reply to this heathenish statement. She appealed to the universe. Did you ever hear the like? I know what your God is like, said Emily. I saw his picture in that Adam and Eve book of yours. He has whiskers and wears a nightgown. I don't like him, but I like Father's God. And what is your father's God like, if I may ask? Asked Ellen sarcastically. Emily hadn't any idea what Father's God was like, but she was determined not to be posed by Ellen. He is clear as the moon, fair as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners, she said triumphantly. Well, you're bound to have the last word, but the Murrays will teach you what's what, said Ellen, giving up the argument. They're strict Presbyterians and won't hold by any of your father's awful notions. Get off upstairs. Emily went up to the south room, feeling very desolate. Now, I'm in the southern hemisphere in New Zealand, and so to me the north side of the house is the warm side. In the northern hemisphere, the south side of the house is the warm side. So the southern room upstairs will be the one that's on the sunny side of the house. And I'm just going to see if I can... I feel like I'm a bit washed out here. I'm wondering if I should... No, let's just leave it alone. Don't fiddle with the camera again. Right. Emily went up to the south room, feeling very desolate. There isn't anybody in the world who loves me now, she said as she curled up on her bed by the window. But she was determined she would not cry. The Murrays, who had hated her father, would not see her crying. She felt that she detested them all, except perhaps Aunt Laura. How very big and empty the world had suddenly become. Nothing was interesting any more. It did not matter that the little squat apple tree between Adam and Eve had become a thing of rose and snow beauty, blossoms. That the hills beyond the hollow were of green silk, purple misted, that the daffodils were out in the garden, that the birches were hung all over with golden tassels, that the wind woman was blowing white young clouds across the sky. None of these things had any charm or consolation for her now. In her inexperience, she believed they would never have again. "But I promised father I'd be brave," she whispered, clenching her little fists. "And I will. And I won't let the Murrays see I'm afraid of them. I won't be afraid of them." When the far-off whistle of the afternoon train blew beyond the hills, Emily's heart began to beat. She clasped her hands and lifted her face. "Please help me, father's God, not Ellen's God," she said. "Help me to be brave and not cry before the Murrays." Soon after, there was the sound of voices below. Wheels below, sorry. Soon after, there was the sound of wheels below, and voices, loud, decided voices. Then Ellen came puffing up the stairs with the black dress, a sleazy thing of cheap merino. Because you wore black when it was to do with someone having died, to show respect. That's the way it was. "Mrs. Hubbard's just got it done in time, thanks be. I wouldn't have had the Murrays see you not in black for the world. They can't say I haven't done my duty. They're all here, the New Moon people, and Oliver and his wife, your Aunt Addie, and Wallace and his wife, your Aunt Eva, and Aunt Ruth, Mrs. Dutton her name is. There, you're ready now. Come along." "Can't I put my Venetian beads on?" asked Emily. "Did you ever any mortal?" "Venetian beads with a morning dress. Shame on you. Is this a time to be thinking of vanity?" "It isn't vanity," cried Emily. "Father gave me those beads last Christmas, and I want to show the Murrays that I've got something." "No more of your nonsense. Come along, I say. Mind your manners. There's a good deal depends on the impression you make on him." Emily walked rigidly downstairs before Ellen and into the parlour. 8 people were sitting around it, and she instantly felt the critical gaze of 16 stranger eyes. She looked very pale and plain in her black dress. The purple shadows left by weeping made her large eyes look too large and hollow. She was desperately afraid, and she knew it, but she would not let the Murrays see it. She held up her head and faced the ordeal before her gallantly. "This," said Ellen, walking her round by the shoulder, "is your Uncle Wallace." Emily shuddered and put out a cold hand. She did not like Uncle Wallace. She knew that at once. He was black and grim and ugly, with frowning, bristly brows and a stern, unpitying mouth. He had big pouches under his eyes and carefully trimmed black side whiskers. Emily decided then and there that she did not admire side whiskers. That's what we call sideburns or sideboards. That's where men grow. It's like the start of a beard. This bit down here, they don't shave that. They let it grow out, and it hangs down or it fluffs out. And his were beautifully trimmed. And then it comes down to a beard, if they have a beard. But there was a fashion where men would have their hair and then their side whiskers, and that was it. Sometimes they'd have a moustache as well. "How do you do, Emily?" he said coldly, and just as coldly he bent forward and kissed her cheek. A sudden wave of indignation swept over Emily's soul. How dared he kiss her? He had hated her father, and disowned her mother. She would have none of his kisses. Flash quick, she snatched her handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her outraged cheek. "Well, well," exclaimed a disagreeable voice from the other side of the room. Uncle Wallace looked as if he would like to say a great many things, but couldn't think of them. Ellen, with a grunt of despair, propelled Emily to the next sitter. "Your Aunt Eva," she said. Aunt Eva was sitting huddled up in a shawl. She had the fretful face of the imaginary invalid. She shook hands with Emily and said nothing. Neither did Emily. "Your Uncle Oliver," announced Ellen. Emily rather liked Uncle Oliver's appearance. He was big and fat and rosy and jolly looking. She thought she would not mind so much if he kissed her in spite of his bristly white moustache. But Uncle Oliver had learned Uncle Wallace's lesson, so he didn't lean forward and give her a kiss. "I'll give you a quarter for a kiss," he whispered genially. A joke was Uncle Oliver's idea of being kind and sympathetic, but Emily did not know this and resented it. "I don't sell my kisses," she said, lifting her head as haughtily as any Murray of them all could do. Uncle Oliver chuckled and seemed infinitely amused and not a bit offended. But Emily heard a sniff across the room. Aunt Addie was next. She was as fat and rosy and jolly looking as her husband, and she gave Emily's cold hand a nice gentle squeeze. "How are you, dear?" she said. That dear touched Emily and thawed her a trifle, but the next in turn froze her up instantly again. It was Aunt Ruth. Emily knew it was Aunt Ruth before Ellen said so, and she knew it was Aunt Ruth who had welled and sniffed. She knew the cold grey eyes, the prim, dull brown hair, the short, stout figure, the thin, pinched, merciless mouth. Aunt Ruth held out the tips of her fingers, but Emily did not take them. "Shake hands with your aunt," said Ellen in an angry whisper. "She does not want to shake hands with me," said Emily distinctly, "and so I am not going to do it." Aunt Ruth folded her scorned hands back on her black silk lap. You are a very ill-bred child," she said, "but of course it was only what was to be expected." Emily felt a sudden compunction. Had she cast a reflection on her father by her behaviour? Perhaps after all she should have shaken hands with Aunt Ruth. But it was too late now. Ellen had already jerked her on. "This is your cousin, Mr. James Murray," said Ellen in a disgusted tone of one who gives up something as a bad job and is only anxious to be done with it. Cousin Jimmy," said that individual. Emily looked steadily at him and liked him at once without any reservations. He had a little rosy, elfish face, with a forked grey beard, his hair curled over his head in a most un-Murray-like mop of glossy brown, and his large brown eyes were as kind and frank as a child's. He gave Emily a hearty handshake, though he looked askance at the lady across from him while he was doing it. "Hello, Puss," he said. Emily began to smile at him, but her smile was, as always, so slow in developing that Ellen had whisked her on before it was in full flower. And it was Aunt Laura who got the benefit of it. Aunt Laura started and paled. "Juliet's smile," she said, half under her breath, and again Aunt Ruth sniffed. Aunt Laura did not look like anyone else in the room. She was almost pretty, with her delicate features and the heavy coils of pale, sleek, fair hair, faintly greyed, pinned closely all round her head. But it was her eyes that won Emily. They were such round, blue eyes. One never quite got over the shock of their blueness, and when she spoke it was in a beautiful, soft voice. "You poor dear little child," she said, and put her arm around Emily for a gentle hug. Emily returned the hug and had a narrow escape then from letting the Murrays see her cry. All that saved her was the fact that Ellen suddenly pushed her on into the corner by the window. "And this is your Aunt Elizabeth." Yes, this was Aunt Elizabeth. No doubt about that. She had on a stiff black satin dress, so stiff and rich that Emily felt sure it must be her very best. This pleased Emily. Whatever Aunt Elizabeth thought of her father, at least she had paid him the respect of her best dress. And Aunt Elizabeth was quite fine-looking in a tall, thin, austere style, with clear-cut features and a massive coronet of iron-grey hair under her black lace cap. But her eyes, though steel blue, were as cold as Aunt Ruth's, and her long, thin mouth was compressed severely. Under her cool, appraising glance, Emily retreated into herself and shut the door of her soul. She would have liked to please Aunt Elizabeth, who was boss at New Moon, but she felt she could not do it. Aunt Elizabeth shook hands and said nothing, the truth being that she did not know exactly what to say. Elizabeth Murray would not have felt put about before King or Governor-General. The Murray pride would have carried her through there, but she did feel disturbed in the presence of this alien, level-gazing child who had already shown that she was anything but meek and humble. Though Elizabeth Murray would never have admitted it, she did not want to be snubbed as Wallace and Ruth had been. "Go and sit on the sofa," ordered Ellen. Emily sat on the sofa with her eyes cast down, a slight, black, indomitable little figure. She folded her hands on her lap and crossed her ankles. They should see she had manners. Ellen had retreated to the kitchen, thanking her stars that was over. Emily did not like Ellen, but she felt deserted when Ellen was gone. She was alone now before the bar of Murray opinion. She would have given anything to be out of the room, yet in the back of her mind a design was forming of writing all about it in the old account book. It would be interesting. She could describe them all. She knew she could. She had the very word for Aunt Ruth's eyes, stone grey. They were just like stones, as hard and cold and relentless. Then a pang tore through her heart. Father could never again read what she wrote in the account book. Still, she felt that she would rather like to write it all out. How could she best describe Aunt Laura's eyes? They were such beautiful eyes. Just to call them blue meant nothing. Hundreds of people had blue eyes. Oh, she had it. Wells of blue. That was the very thing. And then the flash came. It was the first time since the dreadful night when Ellen had met her on the doorstep. She had thought it would never come again, and now in this most unlikely place and time it had come. She had seen with other eyes than those of sense the wonderful world behind the veil. Courage and hope flooded her cold little soul like a wave of rosy light. She lifted her head and looked about her undauntedly. Brazenly, Aunt Ruth afterwards declared. Yes, she would write them all out in the account book, describe every last one of them. Sweet Aunt Laura, nice Cousin Jimmy, grim old Uncle Wallace, and moon-faced Uncle Oliver, stately Aunt Elizabeth, and detestable Aunt Ruth. "She's a delicate-looking child," said Aunt Eva, suddenly in her fretful, colourless voice. "Well, what else could you expect?" said Aunt Addie with a sigh that seemed to Emily to hold some dire significance. "She's too pale. If she had a little colour, she wouldn't be bad-looking." "I don't know who she looks like," said Uncle Oliver, staring at Emily. "She's not a Murray, that is plain to be seen," said Aunt Elizabeth decidedly and disapprovingly. "They are talking about me just as if I wasn't here," thought Emily, her heart swelling with indignation over the indecency of it. "I wouldn't call her a star either," said Uncle Oliver. "Seems to me she's more like the birds. She's got her grandmother's hair and eyes." "She's got old George Bird's nose," said Aunt Ruth, in a tone that left no doubt as to her opinion of George's nose. "She's got her father's forehead," said Aunt Eva, also disapprovingly. Yes, it was very much a thing where you would discuss a child over the child's head. Now, Emily was, I think, 10 or 11, so she's not quite such a little child, but it was considered okay to do this. I don't get it either. "She has her mother's smile," said Aunt Laura, but in such a low tone that nobody heard her. "And Juliet's long lashes. Hadn't Juliet very long lashes?" said Aunt Addie. Emily had reached the limit of her endurance. "You make me feel as if I was made up of scraps and patches," she burst out indignantly. Murray stared at her. Perhaps they felt some compunction, for after all none of them were ogres, and all were human, more or less. Apparently nobody could think of anything to say, but the shocked silence was broken by a chuckle from Cousin Jimmy, a low chuckle, full of mirth and free from malice. "That's right, Puss," he said. "Stand up to him. Take your own part." "Jimmy," said Aunt Ruth. Jimmy subsided. Aunt Ruth looked at Emily. "When I was a little girl," she said, "I never spoke until I was spoken to." "But if nobody ever spoke until they were spoken to, there would be no conversation," said Emily, argumentatively. I never answered back, Aunt Ruth went on severely. In those days, little girls were trained properly. We were polite and respectful to our elders. We were taught our place and we kept it. I don't believe you ever had much fun, said Emily, and then gasped in horror. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. She had only meant to think it, but she had such an old habit of thinking aloud to father. Fun, said Aunt Ruth in a shocked tone. I did not think of fun when I was a little girl. No, I know, said Emily gravely. Her voice and manner were perfectly respectful, for she was anxious to atone for her involuntary lapse. Yet Aunt Ruth looked as if she would like to box her ears. This child was pitying her, insulting her by being sorry for her because of her prim, impeccable childhood. It was unendurable, especially in a star. And that abominable Jimmy was chuckling again. Elizabeth should suppress him. Fortunately, Ellen Green appeared at this juncture and announced supper. You've got to wait, she whispered to Emily. There ain't room for you at the table. Emily was glad. She knew she could not eat a bite under the Murrays' eyes. Her aunts and uncles filed out stiffly without looking at her, all except Aunt Laura, who turned at the door and blew her a tiny, furtive kiss. Before Emily could respond, Ellen Green had shut the door. Emily was left all alone in the room that was filling with twilight shadows. The pride that had sustained her in the presence of the Murrays suddenly failed her, and she knew that tears were coming. She went straight to the closed door at the end of the parlour, opened it, and went in. Her father's coffin stood in the centre of the small room which had been a bedroom. It was heaped with flowers. The Murrays had done the proper thing in that, as in all else. The great anchor of white roses Uncle Wallace had brought stood up aggressively on the small table at the head. Emily could not see her father's face for Aunt Ruth's heavily fragrant pillow of white hyacinths lying on the glass, and she dared not move it, but she curled herself up on the floor and laid her cheek against the polished side of the casket. They found her there asleep when they came in after supper. Aunt Laura lifted her up and said, I'm going to take the poor child up to bed. She's worn right out. Emily opened her eyes and looked drowsily about her. Can I have Mike? She said. Who's Mike? My cat, my big grey cat. A cat? Exclaimed Aunt Elizabeth in a shocked tone. You must not have a cat in your bedroom. Why not? For once, pleaded Laura. Certainly not, said Aunt Elizabeth. A cat is a most unwholesome thing in a sleeping apartment. I'm surprised at you, Laura. Take the child up to bed and see that there are plenty of bedclothes. It is a cold night, but let me hear no more talk of sleeping with cats. Mike is a clean cat, said Emily. He washes himself every day. Take her up to bed, Laura, said Aunt Elizabeth, ignoring Emily. Aunt Laura yielded meekly. She carried Emily upstairs, helped her undress, and tucked her into bed. Emily was very sleepy, but before she was wholly asleep, she felt something soft and warm and purry and companionable snuggling down by her shoulder. Aunt Laura had sneaked down, found Mike, and brought him up to her. Aunt Elizabeth never knew, and Ellen Green dared not say a word in protest, for was not Laura a Murray of New Moon? And that's the end of that chapter. So what do you think so far? Oh, she's a headstrong one, isn't she? Oh my goodness. I'm just going to see if there are actually any illustrations that are meant to be in the book. I don't think there are, but just in case. And I do hope my typing is not too thunky. Let's have a look. Let's see if we can find anything so you can look at it apart from me. Oh, and by the way, this is the author. This is Ms. Montgomery, Lucy Maud Montgomery. She's got pince-nez glasses on. So far, all I have found is that cover picture of when she saw the flash. And everything else is illustrations either from someone else's imagination who is like fan art, or someone who's writing up a graphic novel, which means it's a modern picture and so therefore is still under tight copyright, or from one of the TV series. That's all. I cannot find any illustrations of the book. So I'm going to guess it was a chapter book for older young people. And we shall carry on. But because it's a chapter break, I'm going to have a cup of coffee. Well, a mouthful of coffee. I'm also going to give you a link to the graphic novel that someone has been writing and illustrating. It looks so far lovely. Don't know that oh, yep, it did. There you go, there's the link. At jevvdimensions.com, Emily of New Moon. I think she's probably captured quite well the feel of it, although not so sure about the visible fairies in the illustrations, but that's okay. So there you go, that's someone's imagination has helped them to illustrate a version of the story. Someone else who's discovered this book and the story and loved it, I would guess. And I'll just get that one out of the way so that my computer is not getting choked up by it. Just because sometimes my computer gets a little bit overwhelmed by things. It does. Sorry. It's just the way life is. Oh, come on. My browser is now being really slow. I'm going to give you a blow-by-blow account of what's happening. Silence for 5 minutes. Nothing is happening. Sorry about the faces. That's just the way life is. Right, shall we carry on? I'm not snacking today because I don't have any more snacks. I've had my banana. Well, there's a little bit of it left, but bananas are a bit messy to eat. I'm just going to top up my proper water bottle, my story time water bottle. Yes, that's the sound of water pouring. You might want to quickly rush off and go to the loo while I'm doing this rattling and banging around. Oh good, we do have a few more people here now. Yay. Hi everybody. And no, I'm not going to call you all out. I'm just going to, I'm just noticing, that's all. Not that you have to be actually active in chat or anything, because you know already that you don't need to be. I'm just, I like to keep an eye on what's going on because I have been hate botted before and I'm not really keen on that. So I just like to keep an eye on what's going on, what's nearby in my channel. Yes, I am all over the place at the moment. Right, let's carry on reading after I've had my mouth full of water. How are we going? It's nearly 4 o'clock, so we're going to read one more chapter. It's 22 pages, so it's not as long as my previous book had like 30 and 40 something pages per chapter, which is why we're doing a second chapter today. So, Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery. Yes, I know I'm sitting a little bit low now. And we are reading chapter 4, A Family Conclave. And if you've just arrived, this illustration here over my right shoulder, that is the author, who was, at the time of writing the I'll try that one again. At the time of writing I could have kept on talking, couldn't I? At the time of writing the Anne of Green Gables stories, was living on Prince Edward Island. And for some reason, I can't remember when she was living, when she wrote Emily of New Moon, but it is very definitely set on Prince Edward Island in Canada. And either it was after she had been living there and she was now living elsewhere on mainland Canada and had very fond memories of being over there and basically was writing reminiscently, because they do say that this book has a lot more of her own life experiences in it than her other books did. Or she was actually still living on the island at the time. I don't know. Maybe somebody can look it up. Maybe somebody who's in the background actually has been to Prince Edward Island. I don't know if I have or not. I have been in Canada. I have lived for 6 months at a time, I think it was, in Canada when I was really little. I remember doing Halloween trick-or-treating, dressed up as a little bat. And my aunt, yes, my aunt, who was 6 months younger than me, my mother's stepsister, she was dressed up as a clown, and I remember having to go to find a cushion to put inside her outfit. We don't do that sort of thing very much, really, in New Zealand. So it was all part of my memories of growing up, being in Canada at the right time of year for that sort of thing. And I don't know, I do know that we went to Montreal, among other places. I think it was Montreal and Quebec City. I don't know. I don't know if we went to Prince Edward Island. I've got relatives from one side of Canada to the other. There's probably not so many right in the middle, but I do have a lot of relatives over there. It's just I don't actually really have a lot directly to do with them. Anyway, I'm going to carry on reading. We are going to read chapter 4, A Family Conclave. And I'll try not to chat too much. Emily awakened at daylight the next morning. Through her low, uncurtained window, the splendour of the sunrise was coming in, and one faint white star was still lingering in the crystal green sky over the rooster pine. Have you noticed that if you're up early enough, with the light starting to come into the sky before the sun's up, the sky changes from being dark blue, and before it gets to that normal daytime blue, it's got this greenish tinge to it sometimes. Have you seen that? Have you noticed that? It's quite intriguing. Because we think of the sky as being blue, but it's not necessarily. So there was a white star, a faint white star, still lingering in the crystal green sky over the rooster pine. A fresh, sweet wind of dawn was blowing around the eaves. Ellen Green was sleeping in the big bed and snoring soundly. Except for that, the little house was very still. It was the chance for which Emily had waited. Very carefully she slipped from her bed, tiptoed across the room and opened the door. Mike uncoiled himself from the mat on the middle of the floor and followed her, rubbing his warm sides against her chilly little ankles. Almost guiltily she crept down the back dark staircase. How the steps creaked. Surely it would waken everybody. But nobody appeared. And Emily got down and slipped into the parlour, drawing a long breath of relief as she closed the door. She almost ran across the room to the other door. Aunt Ruth's floral pillow still covered the glass of the casket. Emily, with a tightening of the lips that gave her face an odd resemblance to Aunt Elizabeth, lifted up the pillow and set it on the floor. "Oh, Father, Father," she whispered, putting her hand to her throat to keep something down. She stood there, a little shivering, white-clad figure, and looked at her father. This was to be her goodbye. She must say it when they were alone together. She would not say it before the Murrays. Father looked so beautiful. All the lines of pain had vanished. His face almost looked like a boy's, except for the silver hair above it, and he was smiling, such a nice, whimsical, wise little smile, as if he had suddenly discovered something lovely and unexpected and surprising. She had seen many nice smiles on his face in life, but never one just like this. "Father, I didn't cry before them," she whispered. "I'm sure I didn't disgrace the stars. Not shaking hands with Aunt Ruth wasn't disgracing the stars, was it? Because she didn't really want me to. Oh, Father, I don't think any of them like me, unless perhaps Aunt Laura does a little. And I'm going to cry a little bit now, Father, because I can't keep it back all the time." She laid her face on the cold glass and sobbed bitterly, but briefly. She must say good-bye before anyone found her. Raising her head, she looked long and earnestly at the beloved face. "Good-bye, dearest darling," she whispered, chokingly. Dashing away her blinding tears, she replaced Aunt Ruth's pillow, hiding her father's face from her forever. Then she slipped out, intent on speedily regaining her room. At the door, she almost fell over Cousin Jimmy, who was sitting on a chair before it, swathed in a huge checked dressing gown, and nursing Mike. "Shh," he whispered, patting her on the shoulder. "I heard you coming down and followed you. I knew what you wanted. I've been sitting here to keep them out, if any of them came after you. Here, take this and hurry back to your bed, small puss." This was a roll of peppermint lozenges. Emily clutched it and fled, overcome with shame at being seen by Cousin Jimmy in her nightgown. She hated peppermints and never ate them, but the fact of Cousin Jimmy Murray's kindness in giving them to her sent a thrill of delight to her heart, and he called her small puss too. She liked that. She had thought nobody would ever call her nice pet names again. Father had had so many of them for her, sweetheart and darling and Emily child and dear wee kidlet and honey and elfkin. He had a pet name for every mood, and she had loved them all. As for Cousin Jimmy, he was nice. Whatever part of him was missing, it wasn't his heart. She felt so grateful to him that after she was safely in her bed again, she forced herself to eat one of the lozenges, though it took all her grit to worry it down. She really doesn't like peppermint, does she? The funeral was held that forenoon. That means before noon, like afternoon. We still use afternoon, we don't use forenoon anymore. Maybe we need to bring it back. The funeral was held that forenoon. For once the lonesome little house in the hollow was filled. The coffin was taken into the parlour, and the Murrays, as mourners, sat stiffly and decorously all round it, Emily among them, pale and prim in her black dress. She sat between Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle Wallace and dared not move a muscle. No other star was present. Her father had no near living relatives. The Maywood people came and looked at his dead face with a freedom and insolent curiosity they would never have presumed on in life. So the area they were living was called Maywood. There you go. Emily hated to have them looking at her father like that. They had no right. They hadn't been friendly to him when he was alive. They had said harsh things of him. Ellen Green had sometimes repeated them. Every glance that fell on him hurt Emily, but she sat still and gave no outward sign. Aunt Ruth said afterwards that she had never seen a child so absolutely devoid of all natural feeling. I have the feeling that if she had been expressing feelings, Aunt Ruth would have chided her for that. Can't win with Aunt Ruth. Not that particular Aunt Ruth, anyway. When the service was over, the Murrays rose and marched round the coffin for a dutiful look of farewell. Aunt Elizabeth took Emily's hand and tried to draw her along with them, but Emily pulled it back and shook her head. She had said her goodbye already. Aunt Elizabeth seemed for a moment to be on the point of insisting. Then she grimly swept onward, alone, looking every inch a Murray. No scene must be made at a funeral. Douglas Starr was to be taken to Charlottetown for burial beside his wife. The Murrays were all going, but Emily was not to go. She watched the funeral procession as it wound up the long grassy hill through the light grey rain that was beginning to fall. Emily was glad it was raining. Many a time she had heard Ellen Green say that happy was the corpse the rain fell on, and it was easier to see father go away in that soft, kind grey mist than through sparkling, laughing sunshine. "Well, I must say the funeral went off fine," said Ellen Green at her shoulder. "Everything's been done regardless. If your father was looking down from heaven at her, Emily, I'm sure he'd be pleased." "He isn't in heaven," said Emily. "Good gracious of all the children!" Ellen could say no more. "He isn't there yet. He's only on the way. He said he'd wait around and go slow until I died, too, so that I could catch up with him. I hope I'll die soon." "That's a wicked, wicked thing to wish," rebuked Ellen, because in her mind it was. When the last buggy had disappeared, Emily went back to the sitting room, got a book out of the bookcase and buried herself in the wing chair. The women who were tidying up were glad she was quiet and out of the way. "It's well she can read," said Mrs. Hubbard gloomily. "Some little girls couldn't be so composed. Jenny Hood just screamed and shrieked after they carried her mother out. The Hoods are all such feeling people. Emily was not reading. She was thinking. She knew the Murrays would be back in the afternoon, and she knew her fate would probably be settled then. "We'll talk the matter over when we come back," she had heard Uncle Wallace saying that morning after breakfast. Some instinct told her just what the matter was, and she would have given one of her pointed ears to hear the discussion with the other. But she knew very well she would be sent out of the way, so she was not surprised when Ellen came to her in the twilight and said, "You'd better go upstairs, Emily. Your aunts and uncles are coming in here to talk over the business." "Can't I help you with supper?" said Emily, who thought that if she were going and coming around the kitchen she might catch a word or two. "No, you'd be more bother than help. March now." I'm guessing that Ellen thinks that she would catch a word or two around the kitchen, and it wouldn't be appropriate. Ellen waddled out to the kitchen without waiting to see if Emily marched. Emily got up reluctantly. How could she sleep tonight if she did not know what was going to happen to her? And she felt quite sure she would not be told till morning, if then. Her eyes fell on the oblong table in the centre of the room. Its cloth was of generous proportions, hanging in heavy folds to the floor. There was a flash of black stockings across the rug, a sudden disturbance of drapery, and then silence. Emily sat on the floor under the table, arranged her legs comfortably, and sat triumphant. She would hear what was decided, and nobody would be any the wiser. She had never been told that it was not considered strictly honourable to eavesdrop, no occasion for such instruction ever having arisen in her life with her father, and she considered that it was a bit of pure luck that she had thought of hiding under the table. She could even see dimly through the cloth. Her heart beat so loudly in her excitement that she was afraid they would hear it. There was no other sound save the soft, far-away singing of frogs through the rain. That sounded through the open window. In they came, down they sat, round the room. Emily held her breath. For a few minutes nobody spoke, though Aunt Eva sighed long and heavily. Then Uncle Wallace cleared his throat and said, "Well, what is to be done with the child?" Nobody was in a hurry to answer. Emily thought they would never speak. Finally Aunt Eva said with a whine, "She's such a difficult child, so odd. I can't understand her at all." "I think," said Aunt Laura timidly, "that she has what one might call an artistic temperament." "She's a spoiled child," said Aunt Ruth very decidedly. "There's work ahead to straighten out her manners, if you ask me." The little listener under the table turned her head and shot a scornful glance at Aunt Ruth through the tablecloth. "I think that your own manners have a slight curve." Emily did not dare even to murmur the words under her breath, but she shaped them with her mouth. This was a great relief and a satisfaction. "I agree with you," said Aunt Eva, "and I, for one, do not feel equal to the task." Emily understood that this meant Uncle Wallace did not mean to take her, and she rejoiced thereat. "The truth is," said Uncle Wallace, "Aunt Nancy ought to take her. She has more of this world's goods than any of us." "Aunt Nancy would never dream of taking her, and you know it well enough," said Uncle Oliver. "Besides, she's entirely too old to have the bringing up of a child, her and that old witch, Caroline. Upon my soul, I don't believe either of them is human. I would like to take Emily, but I feel that I can hardly do it. I've a large family to provide for." "She's not likely to live long to bother anyone," said Aunt Elizabeth crisply. "She'll probably die of consumption, same as her father did." Just an aside here, consumption is what we now call tuberculosis, and it was a disease of the lungs, and basically it slowly choked you to death. It was a horrible death. Yeah. And not uncommonly, people died of it. Once you had it, it was basically long-term fatal. Some people died slowly, some died more quickly. One of the supposed cures was to send people to hospitals that were high up mountains where they had very fresh air with no pollution, because it was recognised that the smoke from coal fires especially, but also other fires used for heating houses and people living in towns, and so therefore all the smoke and the pollution would hang around in winter in cold climates. All that would make it even harder for someone with their breathing, and so they were sent away to go and live at a sanatorium, which is a type of health hospital often up in the mountains where it's very, very fresh air. Probably means it's cold and there's lots of wind. Anyway, but yes, said to be something that was quite commonly done. If people could do it, if they actually had somewhere that they could send someone to and they could afford to send someone away to be cared for in that manner. Because not everybody could. Anyway, I'll carry on with this. Consumption, same as her father did. I won't, exclaimed Emily. At least she thought it, with such vim that it almost seemed that she exclaimed it. Just as well she didn't. She forgot that she had wanted to die soon so that she could overtake father. She wanted to live now just to put the Murrays in the wrong. I haven't any intention of dying. I'm going to live for ages and be a famous authoress. You'll just see if I don't, Aunt Elizabeth Murray. She is a weedy-looking child, acknowledged Uncle Wallace. Emily relieved her outraged feelings by making a face at Uncle Wallace through the tablecloth. If I ever possess a pig, I'm going to name it after you, she thought, and then felt quite satisfied with her revenge. Somebody has to look after her as long as she's alive, though, you know, said Uncle Oliver. It would serve you all right if I did die and you suffered terrible remorse for it all the rest of your lives, Emily thought. Then, in the pause that happened to follow, she dramatically pictured out her funeral, selected her pallbearers, and tried to choose the hymn verse that she wanted engraved on her tombstone. But before she could settle this, Uncle Wallace began again. Well, we are not getting anywhere. We have to look after the child. I wish you wouldn't call me the child, thought Emily bitterly. And some of us must give her a home. Juliet's daughter must not be left to the mercy of strangers. Personally, I feel that Eva's health is not equal to the care and training of a child. Of such a child, said Aunt Eva. Emily stuck her tongue out at Aunt Eva. Poor little soul, said Aunt Laura gently. Something frozen in Emily's heart melted. I told you this happens, sorry. Sometimes I get lost halfway through a sentence. Something frozen in Emily's heart melted at that moment. She was pitifully pleased over being called poor little soul so tenderly. Obviously, it seemed very genuine, this sympathy. I do not think you need pity her overmuch, Laura, said Uncle Wallace decidedly. It is evident that she has very little feeling. I have not seen her shed a tear since we came here. Did you notice that she would not even take a last look at her father? Said Aunt Elizabeth. Cousin Jimmy suddenly whistled at the ceiling. She feels so much that she has to hide it, said Aunt Laura. Uncle Wallace snorted. Don't you think we might take her, Elizabeth? Laura went on timidly. Aunt Elizabeth stirred restlessly. I don't suppose she'll be contented at New Moon with 3 old people like us. I would, thought Emily, because there's at least 2 sympathetic people at New Moon. There's Uncle Jimmy and there's Aunt Laura. Ruth, what about you? Said Uncle Wallace. You're all alone in that big house. It would be a good thing for you to have some company. I don't like her, said Ruth sharply. She's as sly as a snake. I'm not, thought Emily. With wise and careful training, many of her faults may be cured, said Uncle Wallace pompously. I don't want them cured. Emily was getting angrier and angrier all the time under the table. I like my faults better than I do your, she fumbled mentally for a word, then triumphantly recalled a phrase of her father's, your abominable virtues. I'm hoping that she doesn't forget that she's meant to be staying silent while all this is happening. She might get discovered. I doubt it, said Aunt Ruth in a biting tone. What's bred in the bone comes out in the flesh. As for Douglas Starr, I think it was perfectly disgraceful for him to die and leave that child without a cent. She has no sympathy, does she? Did he do it on purpose? Asked Cousin Jimmy blandly. I don't think Cousin Jimmy is quite as simple as everyone believes him to be. I think he probably is not a complicated person, but I think he knows that he has a freedom because of the fact that whatever it was happened to him happened, and people allow him to be himself. What do you think? Eh? I wouldn't be surprised at all if Uncle Jimmy is actually a lot sharper than they realise. Did he do it on purpose? Asked Cousin Jimmy blandly. It was the first time he had spoken. He was a miserable failure, snapped Aunt Ruth. He wasn't! He wasn't! Screamed Emily, suddenly sticking her head out from under the tablecloth between the end legs of the table. For a moment, the Murrays sat as silent and motionless as if her outburst had turned them to stone. Then Aunt Ruth rose, stalked to the table, and lifted the cloth, behind which Emily had retired in dismay, realising what she had done. Get up and come out of that, Emily Starr, said Aunt Ruth. Emily Starr got up and came out. She was not specially frightened. She was too angry to be that. Her eyes had gone black and her cheeks crimson. What a little beauty, what a regular little beauty, said Cousin Jimmy, but nobody heard him. Aunt Ruth had the floor. You shameless little eavesdropper, she said. There's the Starr blood coming out. A Murray would never have done such a thing. You ought to be whipped. Father wasn't a failure, cried Emily, choking with anger. You had no right to call him a failure. Nobody who was loved as much as he was could be a failure. I don't believe anybody ever loved you. So it's you that's a failure, and I'm not going to die of consumption. Do you realise what a shameful thing you've been guilty of? Demanded Aunt Ruth, cold with anger. I wanted to hear what was going to become of me, cried Emily. I didn't know it was such a dreadful thing to do. I didn't know you were going to say such horrid things about me. Listeners never hear any good of themselves, said Aunt Elizabeth impressively. Your mother would never have done that, Emily. The bravado all went out of poor Emily. She felt guilty and miserable. Oh, so miserable. She hadn't known, but it seemed she had committed a terrible sin. Go upstairs, said Aunt Ruth. Emily went, without a protest. But before going, she looked round the room. While I was under the table, she said, I made a face at Uncle Wallace and stuck my tongue out at Aunt Eva. She said it sorrowfully, desiring to make a clean breast of her transgressions. But it's so easily do we misunderstand each other that the Murrays actually thought she was indulging in a piece of gratuitous impertinence, like the way I just said it. When the door had closed behind them, they all, except Aunt Laura and Cousin Jimmy, shook their heads and groaned. Emily went upstairs in a state of bitter humiliation. She felt that she had done something that gave the Murrays the right to despise her, and they thought it was the Starr coming out in her, and she had not even found out what her fate was to be. She looked dismally at little Emily in the glass. I didn't know, she whispered. But I'll know after this, she added with sudden vim, and I'll never, never do it again. For a moment, she thought she would throw herself on her bed and cry. She couldn't bear all the pain and shame that were burning in her heart. Then her eyes fell on the old yellow account book on her little table. A minute later, Emily was curled up on her bed, Turk fashion. I think in those days that meant that you were sitting cross-legged. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it was considered to be a Turkish thing that you sit cross-legged. Dunno. Writing eagerly in the old book with her little stubby lead pencil. As her fingers flew over the faded lines, her cheeks flushed and her eyes shone. She forgot the Murrays, although she was writing about them. She forgot her humiliation, although she was describing what had happened. For an hour, she wrote steadily by the wretched light of her smoky little lamp, never pausing, save now and then, to gaze out of the window into the dim beauty of the misty night, while she hunted through her consciousness for a certain word she wanted. When she found it, she gave a happy sigh and fell to again. There's the author. When she heard the Murrays coming upstairs, she put her book away. She had finished. She had written a description of the whole occurrence and of that conclave ring of Murrays, and she had wound up by a pathetic description of her own deathbed, with the Murrays standing around, imploring her forgiveness. At first she depicted Aunt Ruth as doing it on her knees in an agony of remorseful sobs. Then she suspended her pencil. Aunt Ruth couldn't ever feel as bad as that over anything, she thought, and drew her pencil through the line. In the writing, pain and humiliation had passed away. She only felt tired and rather happy. It had been fun, finding words to fit Uncle Wallace, and what exquisite satisfaction it had been to describe Aunt Ruth as a dumpy little woman. I wonder what my uncles and aunts would say if they knew what I really think of them, she murmured as she got into bed. Oh dear, I hope they do not find this book. Oh my goodness. Obviously that's the end of that chapter. And it's 4:30, so I'm going to finish there. And I hope you want to come back and hear more of the story. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen next? So obviously they are going to make a decision as to who she's going to go and live with. Or is she going to decide? I wonder if all of them don't want her to live with them, and so they're going to let her make a choice, and whoever gets her just has to put up with it in their minds. They've got such a biased opinion of everybody but themselves, don't they? Goodness me. I try not to be like that. And thank you for the follow. That's wonderful. So, what have we got coming up next? The next chapter is Diamond Cut Diamond, chapter 5. Diamond cut diamond. What does that mean? What does that mean about the story? Does this mean that there's going to be people at loggerheads because they're going to be, it's like iron sharpens iron, where they're against each other? Wouldn't be too surprised if that's what happens. Oh, goodness me. We'll see. We'll see. Okay, so I need to just round up by telling you, because I'm about to finish off, obviously. Don't forget to come back, listen to some more, find out what happens next. Well, stay excited about the story. That'll motivate you. Thank you for being here. It's really lovely to have people enjoying the stories. I hope that you're enjoying it. Enjoying the reading anyway. It is a story that I've read when I was younger, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was probably a little bit too young to read the sequels. I was in my teens, and I think it's one of those books, those series, where if you read it when you're a bit older than what the story is set, you probably have a greater appreciation for it. Anyway, so I'm going to finish off by saying, don't forget to follow me or subscribe, depending on if you're on YouTube or Twitch, if you haven't already done it. If you do those things, then whatever service it is that you're actually watching this from will tell you when I either put up a new video or when I go live. Especially on YouTube, if you hit the notification bell, which I don't actually usually do with things. There are one or two things I do that for. Anything else? Sure there's something else. Oh yeah, you might as well give it a like if you're on YouTube. Why not? And if you're watching this on Twitch and you want something more to listen to, if you're enjoying listening to stories and haven't done it before, then go over, well, even if you have done it before, go over to my Twitch channel and pick a playlist, pick a book that either you have wonderful memories of or you've never ever heard of, and have a listen. You'll get all my chatter like this. You'll get all the interruptions in the middle and all that sort of stuff. There's a couple of times where I've cut out a section in the middle where I had to go away from the camera for a few minutes to take a phone call or something, and I've usually scrolled through and actually just cut that piece out of the video. And I know there's one where I had a whole bunch of horrible stuff happening because people came into the chat and were typing it in, and my computer had done a little bit of a hissy fit and wasn't letting me do anything. And so therefore, once it was going again, we got rid of that and blah, blah, blah. But I cut that section out of it, of the video, just because it was like 5 or 10 minutes of sitting there watching this. But anyway, and also on YouTube, I have trimmed it so it's just the video window. rather than having the chat overlay over on the right-hand side of the screen. Because on YouTube, you can actually type comments in there yourself. So there you go. So I look forward to seeing you next time. Don't forget, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 p.m. New Zealand time, whatever that is for you, is when I read live on Twitch. And if you're watching on YouTube, come on over and join us. It's lots of fun. We look up things when we're in the middle of reading a story. We find out what words mean. We discover new stuff. We actually talk about whether or not we've been somewhere. We being, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's actually the listeners, the viewers. All that sort of stuff. It's lots of fun. So thank you. Happy reading in the days ahead of you. And I hope you have a wonderful week for whatever it is that you have ahead of you. We'll see you next time. Bye.